My parents gave my sister $6.9 million and gave me $1. My name is Camila, and I was always the one who got less. I grew up with my sister Isolde in what looked like a picture-perfect family. 2 parents, a nice house, vacations, holiday cards with matching sweaters, the whole polished image. But behind that shiny exterior was a different kind of truth. From as early as I can remember, the line was drawn. Isolde was the golden child. She got everything. The praise, the presents, the spotlight. I got told to tone it down. I still remember birthdays where she'd get the big cake with glittering candles and new clothes from that boutique she loved, while I'd get something practical, like socks or a study lamp. My parents always had a reason. You're the responsible one, or we don't want you to get spoiled. But it wasn't about practicality. It was about hierarchy, and I was always placed beneath her. If I did something good, the response was muted. A quiet good job. If Isolde just existed in a room, it was met with admiration. Look how grown up she looks. She's so graceful. She'll do big things. It only got worse as we got older. I worked my ass off in school, honors classes, student council, volunteer hours. I got accepted into a top university on merit. No legacy admissions. No donations. Just hard work. And when I told my parents, their reaction was a shrug, maybe a distracted, that's nice. Meanwhile, they were posting Isolde's photos from some corporate party, beaming about how elegant she looked, how proud they were of her networking. I used to think if I just achieved more, they'd see me. Really see me. I pushed myself, excelled, stayed quiet when things felt unfair. I learned not to expect anything from them. Not praise, not support, not even acknowledgement. At some point, it wasn't even about jealousy. It was about clarity. I saw the dynamic for what it was. They had already chosen who mattered more. And no amount of degrees, achievements, or milestones on my part was going to change that. Even now, Isolde still gets their full attention. She posts a selfie with a glass of wine, and there in the comments, proud parents gushing like she won the Nobel Prize. I publish a research paper that gets picked up by academic journals, and silence. It's not subtle. It never was. People always say that families are complicated, that no one gets treated exactly the same. But what I went through wasn't just a difference. It was deliberate. It was being made small on purpose. Because they needed one child to shine, and one to stay in the background to make that shine look brighter. And I was the background. Always. The day of Grandpa Walter's will reading felt like something pulled straight out of a Southern drama, minus the tasteful restraint. The whole family had gathered in that sprawling, ivy-draped mansion in Charleston, the same place where we used to play hide and seek as kids, before everything got poisoned by favoritism and whispered comparisons. The air was thick with perfume, sweat, and tension. I walked into the parlor and immediately felt the weight of every glance, every forced smile. Everyone was dressed like they were auditioning for roles in some wealthy family soap opera, pearls, linen suits, manicured grief. And of course, Isolde stood near the fireplace in a perfectly tailored dress, looking like she owned the place already. They all assumed she'd get a sizable inheritance. I mean, of course she would. Grandpa Walter adored her, or at least acted like it. He used to call her his little light, while telling me I had a good head for blending in. I used to think maybe I misread that. Maybe I was being sensitive. But when the lawyer opened that leather folio and started reading, any lingering delusions I had got burned to ash in real time. He began with the usual formalities, listing debts, properties, the contents of the investment accounts. And then it came, the part everyone had been holding their breath for. To my granddaughter Isolde, I leave $6,900,000, my shares in the family trust, and the deed to the Charleston estate. There was a beat of silence, broken by an audible gasp from someone's cousin. Then polite applause. Actual applause. I remember my hands folded in my lap, white-knuckled, digging into my own skin because I already knew what was coming next. And to my granddaughter Camila, the lawyer paused, almost like he didn't want to say it. $1. A single US dollar. The room fell completely quiet, but only for a second. Then I heard the sharp little inhale from my mother, and that fake sympathetic smile stretched across her face like stretched skin. Some children just don't measure up, she said in that sing-song voice she used when she wanted to wound me and make it sound like advice. Laughter bubbled up from across the room, low at first, then louder. Isolde let out this little giggle she didn't bother to hide, and someone near the bar snorted. I sat there, completely still, trying not to let my face betray anything. My stomach was crawling up into my chest, my ears were ringing, and every part of me was screaming to run, to get out of that house, that room, that family. But I didn't move. I stared down at the floor and counted the threads in the rug beneath my chair, each one a reminder that this wasn't a surprise. This was confirmation. I kept hearing their laughter echo in my head, not just the sound of it, but what it meant. They weren't surprised. They weren't shocked. This was what they expected, and maybe even what they wanted. To see me humiliated, small, exactly where they thought I belonged. Just $1. $1 to underline the fact that I wasn't worth more. Not in their eyes. And the worst part? No one even tried to soften it. No, Camila, I'm so sorry. No, Grandpa must have made a mistake. Just silence or smug amusement. Like I was the punchline to a joke that had been building for years and finally landed. I didn't cry. Not then. I refused to give them that. But something inside me, something I'd spent years trying to protect, trying to keep hopeful, snapped. It didn't shatter. It calcified. Quiet and final. Because when someone hands you $1 after a lifetime of telling you to be humble, to not ask for too much, to stay in the background, it's not about money. It's a message. And I got it. Loud and clear. I had already started to stand up, clutching that ridiculous envelope with $1 in it like a final insult, when the lawyer, still seated and smoothing the creases of the next page, cleared his throat and said, "There is one more document." I paused, only because something in his voice shifted, not the rehearsed formality he'd used for the rest of the reading, but something quieter, more careful. He glanced over his glasses at me and then read, "This is a personal letter, to be read aloud at the request of the deceased. It is addressed to Camila Gardner." The room, which had been echoing with whispers and low laughter just minutes ago, fell completely silent again, but this time for a different reason. I felt every eye shift to me, but I kept mine fixed on the thick yellow light pouring in through the high windows. I didn't dare look at anyone. The lawyer unfolded the handwritten page, yellowed slightly, and began. "Camila," he read, voice low but steady. "If you're hearing this, it means I've passed, and you're likely feeling disappointed again. I know what today must have felt like for you. I know how it looked. And I want you to know something I never said enough while I was alive. I saw you. Every quiet act of strength, every accomplishment ignored by the rest of them, every time you showed up for people who never did the same for you. I saw it all. And I was proud." I stopped breathing. The words landed like a gut punch, not because they hurt, but because they came from someone who had never said them aloud while he had the chance. I don't think anyone else in that room was breathing either. The lawyer kept reading. "They always believed the money, the name, the parties, that those were the legacy. But I've spent my life building something more. My work, the research, the breakthroughs no one in this family ever bothered to understand. But you did. You were the only one who ever asked about it. The only one who ever cared enough to listen." My ears were ringing again, but not like before. Not from shame. From something else. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and read the final part slowly. "I leave you the research center, including all associated equipment, patents, and endowment funds. Everything I built with my own hands and my own mind, I leave to yours. Because I believe you'll know what to do with it. I trust you." I didn't look up. I couldn't. But I heard it. The air shifted. Someone let out a sharp gasp. A glass hit the hardwood and shattered. A chair scraped back against the floor. And then came the real reaction. Isolde broke first. Of course she did. She stood, jaw slack, and said something I couldn't even register, her voice rising in pitch, cracking around the edges. She tried to demand an explanation, but her composure was unraveling with every syllable, the facade slipping off her like makeup in the rain. Mom's mouth opened to speak, but nothing came out, just this pale, slack-jawed confusion, and then she crumpled. I don't know if it was real or for show, but she collapsed against the armrest like some delicate heiress in a soap opera. Dad didn't say a word. He stood up slowly, methodically, and walked out of the room like a man who had just realized he never actually knew his father. No one said anything to me. They didn't need to. Their silence was enough. It wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't even about the insult of the dollar or the drama of the moment. It was the fact that everything they thought was secure, their status, their image, their place in the family story, had been rewritten in a voice they couldn't control. I sat there in that same creaky wooden chair, still holding the envelope with the $1 in it, and listened to my name being tied, in front of all of them, to something that actually meant something. Not a house. Not a trust fund. Not stocks or jewelry. Something real. A legacy they had laughed off. A legacy they had ignored. A legacy they never even knew existed, because they never bothered to ask. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I felt seen. And that silence that had always followed me in this family, it finally broke. Not with noise, but with weight. With truth. I got there just after dawn, the sky still a soft bruised lavender, the road behind me empty and quiet. The gate to the research center creaked open with a kind of reverence, the rusted iron hinges slow and deliberate like they knew the weight of this return. It had been years since I'd been here, not since I was a teenager, tagging along behind Grandpa Walter, asking questions he never brushed off, scribbling diagrams in my spiral notebooks while he muttered equations under his breath. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I pulled into the lot, and for a second, I just sat there with the engine off, hands still on the wheel. Everything in me felt like it was bracing for impact. Even though there was no one here to confront, no audience to disappoint, no judgment waiting around the corner. Just the building, low and solid and still wrapped in morning mist, like it had been holding its breath until I showed up. I unlocked the front doors with the key the lawyer had handed me at the end of the reading, tucked inside a smaller envelope marked only with my initials. The lock clicked in a way that felt oddly familiar, like muscle memory. And then I stepped inside. It was exactly as I remembered, and not at all. The air was faintly metallic, the scent of aged paper, old wiring, dust on steel. The lights flickered on overhead with that same tired buzz, one row at a time, revealing the long corridors of lab benches and glass panels and chalkboards that had once been alive with his scrawl. But what stopped me cold wasn't the equipment or the machinery. It was the boxes, dozens of them, all labeled in the same sharp handwriting I'd recognize anywhere. Camila, age 9. Camila's weather log. Camila's hypothesis notebook. Camila, early drafts, handle with care. I knelt down beside one and opened it slowly, fingers trembling slightly, and there they were. My childhood notebooks, my diagrams, the messy pencil sketches of circuits and seed experiments and star charts. He'd saved them all. Not just saved, cataloged, dated, protected. I moved from box to box, and each one felt like a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding finally being released. Tucked beside the folders and notes were little things I'd forgotten. A photo of me holding up my first successful experiment with this wild grin on my face. A scrap of paper with my handwriting that said, "I think science makes people less lonely." And one of his journals, open to a page that read, "She asks better questions than most adults I've worked with. She sees the world like a problem worth solving, not escaping." I pressed a hand against one of the cabinets just to steady myself, because the weight of it hit harder than I expected. This place, it wasn't just a lab. It was a message, a monument built quietly over years, waiting for me. In the back room, where he used to keep his private workbench, was a simple brass plaque bolted to the wall, Camila Gardner Research Center. I stood there, fingers grazing the letters, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt claimed. Not tolerated, not used, not compared, chosen. This place wasn't loud or grand. It wasn't the Charleston estate or a number in a bank account, but it was mine, built with intention, preserved with care, saturated in a kind of love that never had the right words until now. And I knew, in the stillness, in the hum of old machines waiting to be woken up, that I would never again let anyone shrink me to fit their expectations. I belonged here, and for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where I stood. I wasn't even looking for anything when I opened the cabinet in his old office. Not really. I was just tracing the space he'd lived in, trying to feel close to him, to piece together whatever I could of the time we'd lost. The room still smelled like his aftershave, that quiet mix of cedar and ink and something else I could never name, but always recognized. The drawers were neat, methodical, lined folders, paperweights, loose pens still tucked where they belonged. But the small metal cabinet tucked behind his desk, the one I remembered being strictly off-limits when I was little, was unlocked. Inside were rows of meticulously labeled binders, the kind you'd expect for patent filings or experimental notes. But one caught my eye immediately. It was thinner than the rest, deep blue leather, and embossed with a gold stamp on the corner. Call Records, Camila. My throat tightened. I pulled it out, flipped it open, and the first page stopped me cold. There they were, dozens of call logs, printed and annotated by hand. Each date and time recorded in the margins. Each one marked the same way. No answer. Then again, and again, and again, page after page. Some calls were less than a minute apart. Others were late at night, early in the morning, once even on my birthday, the year I cried alone in my room, thinking he'd forgotten. I stared at the paper, heart pounding, because I knew I never saw these calls. Not once. I wasn't dodging him. I never saw a missed call, never heard a voicemail, never got a single message. The lie unraveled all at once. I remembered asking my mom why Grandpa hadn't called back. I remembered her shrugging, barely looking up from her tablet. "He's been distant lately," she'd said. "Don't take it personally. He's tired. He says talking with you is too intense." I remembered Dad chiming in once, some offhand comment about how Grandpa had grown cold in his old age, how he didn't want drama. I remembered believing them. My fingers clenched around the edge of the binder, knuckles white, stomach curdling like I'd been punched. They'd told me he didn't want to talk, that he'd grown distant, that I should stop calling, stop texting, stop hoping. that I was the one being too much, too demanding, too sensitive. The whole time, they were blocking his number behind my back. They stole that from me. Every call I never answered. Every voicemail I never heard. Every late-night attempt he made to reach me when I thought he had already let me go. They turned him into a ghost while he was still alive, and made me believe it was my fault. And the worst part, the part one don't know how to forgive, is that they knew what they were doing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. They saw how close we were, saw that he saw something in me they never could, and they cut the cord with clean hands and hollow excuses. They lied to both of us. They isolated him in his final years, and they left me believing I wasn't worth the effort. I sat on the floor of that office with the binder open on my lap and let the silence press down on me like a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. It wasn't grief anymore. It was fury. It was betrayal so deep it didn't even sting. It just settled into the bones, cold and quiet. Because this was never about being the forgotten one. It was about being erased. And now I knew the truth. They didn't just steal money or recognition. They stole time. They stole him. I didn't plan to share it, not at first. The letter, the binders, the truth, it all felt too raw, too private, like something that had finally been returned to me and should stay untouched. But the longer I sat with it, the more I realized how long they'd gotten away with their version of the story. Years of curated reputations, spotless social images, and tightly guarded secrets, all built on silence, manipulation, and erasure. And I was done being silent. So I filmed it. One take. No edits. Just me. Sitting in the center's library with the lights slanting through the windows behind me, holding the letter in my hands. I read it word for word, the whole thing. Every line about how he'd always seen me, how he'd saved my childhood notebooks, how he trusted me with the legacy of his life's work. And then, without flinching, I showed the call logs. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. I let the evidence speak for itself. I uploaded it to a private local community page, the kind my mother used to post holiday sale graphics in, the one Isolde once used to promote her young professionals networking panels. No hashtags, no captions, just, for those who knew my grandfather, the full truth. I went to sleep thinking maybe a few people would watch it. Friends of his, maybe someone from the foundation board. I woke up to over 8,000 views and 24 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. By mid-morning, it had been shared outside the group, picked up by a local news blog, then reposted on 2 regional outlets. The headline read, Charleston heiress receives $1 in will, but the truth left a family empire in ruin. The fallout was instant. My mother's boutique jewelry store, the one she used to brag had hand-picked elite clientele, emptied almost overnight. Longtime customers pulled their appointments. A local artist publicly demanded his consignment pieces be returned. Someone spray-painted liar across her front window before the city had time to buff it off. Isolde, who'd built her whole professional persona around words like integrity and leadership, was quietly suspended from her firm within 48 hours. Officially, it was a reputational review. Unofficially, someone on her board leaked screenshots of her mocking my inheritance in the family group chat the night of the will reading. It wasn't just cruel. It was damning. I didn't have to say a word. They burned themselves down with their own matches. What shocked me wasn't just the speed. It was the volume. People messaged me. Strangers, friends of my grandfather, women who'd worked with him decades ago, people who remembered seeing me as a kid at fundraisers, always off to the side, never introduced. And every single message said some version of the same thing. We knew something wasn't right. Now we know why. And my family, the ones who'd spent years building an image so tightly wound around control, had no response. No press statement. No apology. Nothing but silence. They'd lied to keep their power. Lied to rewrite the story. Lied to make me small enough to ignore. And now, piece by piece, they were watching everything they clung to collapse under the weight of the truth they tried to bury. I didn't post that video for revenge. I posted it because the truth deserved daylight. And in the end, it didn't scream. It didn't beg. It just stood still, undeniable. And that was enough. It didn't happen all at once. There was no ribbon cutting, no headline-grabbing press release. Just a quiet morning where I walked into the center with a thermos of black coffee and the keys jangling in my coat pocket, flipped on the lights, and decided it was time to start again. Not with legacy or revenge or image, but with use. With purpose. The kind that didn't need permission or applause. At first, it was just me and a whiteboard. I spent hours pacing between the benches, scrubbing old equations off glass panels, rearranging storage closets, and making lists of what was still working, what needed replacing, and what I could turn into something new. The grant money was sitting untouched in the center's endowment, quietly waiting like it had been holding its breath for years. I didn't waste time. I opened up internship spots and emailed every local university with a science department. I didn't ask for recommendations. I asked for grit, curiosity, and kids who couldn't afford to intern without being paid. Within a week, I had my first 4 hires. 2 chemistry majors, a physics undergrad, and 1 high school senior who showed up with a spiral-bound notebook thicker than some dissertations. We cleaned. We scrubbed rust off metal. We calibrated equipment that hadn't been touched in a decade. We opened every window and let air and sunlight pour into the corners that had stayed too quiet for too long. Then we started building. I reached out to public school teachers, real ones, not just administrators, and asked what they needed, what their students lacked. The answers poured in: lab time, supplies, space, mentorship, someone who gave a damn. So we cleared out the back rooms and set up a weekend program for local kids. No fees, no tests, no dress codes. Just curiosity and room to breathe. They came in groups, sometimes with parents, sometimes alone. They touched microscopes for the first time. They asked messy, brilliant, ridiculous questions. And for the first time, they were told, "That's a good one. Let's find out." People started dropping by. Neighbors I'd never met brought baskets of tomatoes, sourdough starters, plum jam, and mason jars with handwritten labels. One woman left a bundle of lavender and a note that said, "For what your grandfather gave this place. For what you're giving it now." A man who used to work maintenance at the lab years ago showed up unannounced, toolbox in hand, and quietly fixed the back gate without asking for anything in return. Someone sent a crate of heirloom seeds, tagged with the words, "For your garden. Every center needs one." There was no stage, no spotlight. Just people, real people. Students who stayed late to finish experiments they didn't want to leave behind. Volunteers who cleaned windows without being asked. Letters from strangers who had seen the video, thanking me not just for what I said, but for not letting it end there. And me, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was fighting to earn my place. I wasn't apologizing for existing. I wasn't shrinking to avoid being called too much or pretending not to care, because that's what made me easier to love. I wasn't being compared, silenced, mocked, or boxed in. I was here, in this place built by hands like mine, turning pain into work and work into something living. No one told me how to do it. No one tried to take it away. And in that quiet, steady rhythm, the doors opening in the morning, the buzz of a soldering iron, the sound of a question being asked with real wonder behind it, I found something I'd never had before. Not just peace, belonging. They invited me to lunch, not a casual family meal, but something rehearsed, polished. The kind of invitation that comes dressed in civility and the scent of manipulation. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. I wanted to see how far they'd go now that the walls were caving in around them. I met them at the old restaurant near Broad and King, the one my mother used to take donors to, the one where she once told me not to order anything that stains the teeth. She was already seated when I arrived, posture perfect, napkin folded delicately in her lap, like this was just another fundraiser brunch. Isolde was there too, of course, lips lined, jaw tight, dressed like she was trying to win something. And then there was Conrad, the family attorney/shadow, the same man who used to hand me envelopes at Christmas without looking me in the eye. They had 3 copies of something printed and clipped in front of them. I hadn't sat down yet, and already I knew. My mother smiled, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Camila, thank you for coming," she said, like we were negotiating seating at a wedding, not decades of betrayal. I sat without responding. She gestured to the papers, sliding one toward me. "We just wanted to talk, calmly, about possibilities, about balance." Isolde leaned forward. "It's not about control," she said, voice syrupy with fake concern. "It's about harmony. The center is incredible, but maybe it's too much for one person. Maybe it makes sense to bring it back into the family fold. Make it more collaborative." Her nails tapped the table softly, a nervous tick she probably thought looked confident. Conrad finally spoke, flat and mechanical. "If you sign these, the legal transfer is clean. The endowment would remain intact. The name wouldn't have to change. It's just an administrative adjustment." I stared at them. They didn't get it. They still thought this was about money, ownership, optics, that they could reframe what had happened as a misunderstanding, a temporary fracture that could be patched with paper and spin. They thought if they used the right tone, the right setting, they could coax me back into being manageable again. I didn't say a word. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the thing I brought for this exact moment, my grandfather's pocket watch. I set it on the table, not forcefully, not dramatically, just gently, quietly. The metal was warm from my hand, the same scuffed brass with the tiny engraving on the back, precision over power. He used to say it every time he caught me rushing through my work. They all looked at it, and I could feel the air shift. "This," I said, my voice low and even, is the only inheritance that means anything to me. I looked each of them in the eye slowly. And you don't get it. No one spoke. My mother blinked first. Isolde looked like she might say something, but her mouth just hung open, caught between outrage and confusion. Conrad, for once, had nothing to file. I stood up, tucked the watch back into my pocket, and left the papers on the table, untouched, because the center wasn't theirs to claim. It never was. They could rewrite wills, block calls, forge closeness with cameras and coordinated outfits, but they couldn't fabricate legacy. They couldn't undo the years he spent building something with purpose, with thought, and choosing, with full clarity, who it would belong to. They lost it the moment they assumed they could take it back, and I didn't need to fight for it, because it was already mine. They kept trying. Emails signed with stiff, clipped affection, letters on heavy stationery that smelled like perfume and dust, postcards from retreats, blank apologies scribbled between nameless beaches and rehearsed smiles. At first, I opened them out of habit, scanning for something that might sound like truth, but there was none, just performance. And after a while, I stopped reading them altogether. I let the envelopes pile up in a drawer I never opened, and eventually, they stopped coming too. I didn't block them to be cruel. I didn't answer because there was nothing left to say. I wasn't looking for closure anymore. I wasn't waiting for recognition or remorse. Peace didn't arrive in a tidy conversation or a symbolic hug. It came in the quiet, in the days I stopped explaining myself, in the hours I spent walking the perimeter of the garden beds at the center, checking soil, listening to wind. It came when I stopped holding the past like a debt I had to pay off, theirs, mine, or anyone's. The center was no longer a project. It had become its own living system. Families came every weekend, not for press, not for spectacle, just to be there. Children who once whispered questions now shouted them with excitement. Teachers brought their classes and stayed long after the bell. Researchers showed up with notebooks and mud on their boots, offering skills instead of resumes. There were bees now, real hives, carefully tended by volunteers who knew how to listen for signs of health. And the herb garden bloomed into something wild and honest, nothing manicured, nothing forced. People left little gifts without names. Handwritten thank you notes taped to the greenhouse door, seedlings in mismatched pots, a jar of honey with a ribbon that read, "You made space." I didn't make speeches. I didn't brand the place. I just kept showing up, unlocking doors, cleaning beakers, kneeling beside raised beds to teach a kid how to check for root rot. My hands stayed dirty most days, my back sore in a way that felt earned. And every time I paused, in the middle of a lesson, or after everyone had gone home, and the only sound was wind rustling through the netted shade, I'd feel it again. Not triumph, not revenge, just stillness, just being. For so long, I believed belonging had to be granted, that it had to come from the people who never saw me, that it had to be proved or begged for. But I was wrong. It's built, slowly, like a garden, one seed at a time, one honest gesture, one day where you refuse to let someone else define your worth. And now, every bee that lands on a flower we planted, every child who calls this place cooler than school, every line of code or row of seedlings or new question pinned to the community board, all of it is proof, not of what I survived, but of what I chose. And I chose this, not them, not anymore. The light was low, soft, the kind of golden haze that settles over the fields right before dusk, the hour when everything breathes a little slower, and the earth feels like it's exhaling. I stood at the threshold of the center, just outside the doors I now opened every morning and locked every night. The gravel warm beneath my shoes, the scent of damp soil and wild mint curling up from the garden beds behind me. In my hand, I held the watch, my grandfather's. The same one he wore during his lectures, the same one he used to time my experiments when I was 9 and convinced that moss could power light bulbs. The brass was worn smooth from use, cool against my palm. I didn't check the hour. I just held it. The truth is, I used to think my worth lived in other people's approval, in applause I never received, in rooms where I was barely allowed to exist. I let their silence shape me. I let their voices carve out the space I thought I was supposed to take up. And for years, I believed them when they said I didn't quite measure up, not because it felt true, but because it was easier to carry their version of me than fight for my own. But now, standing there in the place I rebuilt with my own hands, surrounded by the work we'd done, the real, tangible kind that grows and feeds and teaches, I knew, in every part of me, that I was never the small one. I was never the one who lacked. I was just the one they couldn't control, and that scared them more than anything. They tried to reduce me to $1, tried to erase years of connection with blocked calls and backroom lies. They looked me in the eye and called it balance, like redistributing the future I'd earned would somehow fix the rot they planted in the past. But I didn't bend. I didn't hand it over. And I didn't disappear. Because I'm still here. And they don't get to rewrite that. Not after this. Not ever again.